let people know, and some of the students will probably know this, others don't, that, there are several different versions of the Old Testament in antiquity. And this is true of the Pentateuch, but also, the other portions of the Old Testament as well. We know that the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, but we don't have the original Hebrew of the Old Testament. So we have what we have are several versions that are several generations removed from that one. The primary Bible in the very early church, probably going back to the time of Jesus itself, was the Greek Old Testament, or the Septuagint. Hebrew had not died out completely, but was not super frequently spoken after the Babylonian exile and the Assyrian exile and the various oppression of the people around Palestine, the Jews, by the Greeks and later by the Romans. The Greeks really, really strongly introduced a program of what we would call today soft power, right? And much of the soft power was simply getting other peoples of the world to adopt culture and customs that were Greek, and one of those aspects would be language. And much like, English is the whole world's second language today, and our first language, which we're fortunate to have, in the ancient world, in the world of Jesus, and even in the centuries before that, Greek, especially in and around the Roman Empire, was the second language. And so since the Hebrew was beginning to die out, and the whole knowledge of Hebrew was becoming more and more scarce among Jews living in the diaspora, that is, the places that they had been scattered after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC, it was decided that it might be worthwhile to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And so that project, traditionally took place, in I think, what's the legend? The 70 scholars.
Yeah, the 70
days, yeah. And something like that. But so the phrase 70 became associated with it, and so the Latin LXX becomes abbreviated for the title of that Bible, which is the Septuagint. And indeed, to be really technical, there are several different versions of the Septuagint, but we don't need to worry so much about that here. But the point is that when Jesus is quoting the Old Testament, very frequently he's quoting the Greek Old Testament. When St. Paul or Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or John, the author of Revelations, or the other books of the Bible, Hebrews writer, they're very frequently quoting the Greek Old Testament. So we can ask, well, what was the Bible God inspired? That's one question. And what was the Bible that the early church, including Jesus himself, read? That's another question. That's the Greek one. So early in the church, there was a tradition of reading the Septuagint, and this still holds very much in the Eastern Church today, especially in the Orthodox Church. The Septuagint is just the Old Testament. Now, it gets a little complicated, though, because Jerome is the father of Western biblical scholarship and study. And as we know, Jerome did a lot of work in and around Palestine, although he was a Latin originally. He learned Hebrew at a fairly young age in his career and became convinced that really the Hebrew Old Testament really should be the normative one. And so when he was charged by Pope Damasus of making a new translation, an updated translation into the vernacular language, or the so-called vulgar languages, that is the common language spoken in the Western Roman Empire in the 4th century, he pushed successfully to have the Hebrew be the sort of source text for that. And so we have this sort of dual tradition where, on the one hand, the New Testament writers are reading the Greek Old Testament, but the typical scholars of the Bible, the Old Testament in the Western tradition, have always kind of defaulted to the Hebrew. The Hebrew was by far the most popular among the real hardcore biblical scholars in the Middle Ages, like Hugh of St. Victor Nicholas of Lyra, the famous Oxford School, founded by Bishop Robert Grosseteste, and Adam Marsh, Roger Bacon, those guys. And certainly this became much more true after the Renaissance, where there was an enormous push in the time of the Renaissance to really return to the ancient languages as much as possible. Hebrew being, the ancient language in which the Old Testament was composed. So we've got two versions to choose from. Here's the reality, though. The Hebrew is going to be the source text, from which the Bible that you're reading almost certainly would have been translated from. So that's kind of important to know, that when we're reading these, books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, etc., in the Torah, we're reading a translation from the Hebrew Old Testament, not from the Greek Old Testament.
And the early version of the Septuagint was not a Christian creation. It was not the idea that, well, the church is going to create a new version of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible so that it could use this in some manner. These were prevalent and read in the major synagogues in the diaspora, and had quite a history even before the writing of the New Testament.
That's right. So the original project of doing the translation was done by the Jews themselves. They were the ones who took the early versions of the Hebrew that they had, and rendered them into Greek, so that the Jews, in the diaspora, there were Jewish communities in all the major cities of the Roman Empire, in Rome, Corinth, Alexandria, certainly, that they could read the Bible in their, primarily language of educated people, certainly their second language, if not their first language, which would have been Greek. So what's interesting is that although the Bible is originally in Hebrew, that the Greek version we have probably in some cases preserves the earlier reading than the Hebrew we have, and that's because the Hebrew we have is later. The Hebrew we have is the so-called Masoretic text. The Masoretic text was the brilliant effort of scholars much after the Christian era, so we're talking several centuries after the Christian era, probably 5th, 6th, 7th century, is that about when I think it was? And what they did is that they decided to take the Hebrew that they had and add vocalization to it, so their vowel points to it, because they were concerned that the tradition of the vocalization of the Hebrew would be lost. Hebrew is like most Semitic languages in that typically there are no vowels. The vowels aren't written. You just know how to pronounce it because you know the language. Maybe this is their way of saving parchment. We don't know exactly, but they didn't use vowels very frequently. But what the Masoretes did was that they devised a very, very clever pointing system in the so-called Masoretic text. And this is the early version we have. So this is the other oddity in the tradition, that we have originally the Greek version was Jewish created, but ultimately was preserved by many people, including Christians. Mm-hmm. The Hebrew version that we have is much later than the Greek version. However, it's Jewish, and so but it's the version that we use in the Christian church today. Catholics as well as Protestants, almost any modern vernacular translation will be based on the Masoretic text, which for all intents and purposes is 500, 600, 700 years later than the time of Jesus. So,
but if you've ever read any of the rabbinical commentaries like Rashi, some of these ones that are in unpointed Hebrew,
right,
you love the Masoretes,
yes,
all the more.
Yeah.
They anticipated Wheel of Fortune,
right,
where you have to buy a vowel, right?
That's right.
Oh, that's terrible.
That's
That's
right.
You don't encourage me. Don't encourage me, Pete.
Yeah.
But
well, that's the thing, Rick. And if you know the language, you can do a lot with the language if you change the vowel points.
Yeah.
So you can make one word into an entirely different word. So, there's a big question about, I think the vowel points almost always are correct, but 99% correct means that there might be, some different possible interpretations there. And that's, of course, why you study Hebrew, because, you want to go back and look at the MT, the Masoretic text, and say, well, okay, this verse doesn't quite make sense. I wonder if that word was a little off there or something like that. So sometimes you can play the game of.
So how has the the general translation and proliferation of the Dead Sea, the Qumran material, affected the Masoretic text into what?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that gets the Qumran is, of course, was a whole different textual tradition that was discovered in 1947, 48, I think, a couple years after World War II. It was discovered in a cave in Israel near the Dead Sea, in a little village called Qumran, since abandoned. But we know now that there was a sizable religious community there. And yes, there's a whole different textual tradition. Most of the Qumran text of the Bible that have survived the fragments, and most of them are fragments, are in Hebrew, unpointed Hebrew. They tend to be actually closer to the Greek in most respects than they are to the MT, to the Masoretic text. But nevertheless, they are a third different textual tradition entirely. So that's another little interesting footnote here. So, yeah.
Well, other things that our students should be aware of when they're reading something coming from the MT versus the Septuagint?
Yeah. So I would say that the differences between the MT and the LXX are not enormous. Okay. It's not, for the most part, it's not the kind of thing that's going to exercise you as a Bible reader, although it's something you should from time to time be aware of. Mm-hmm. Now, one obvious difference is the actual names of the books of the Torah. Well, there's two names. The Torah is, of course, a Hebrew name. The Pentateuch is a Greek name. And the 5 books that are made up of those actually have different names in the Hebrew. Now, the names that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are the Greek names. Okay, in the Hebrew, they have different names. And typically, and Rick knows this too, that they usually will name themselves after the very first couple of words in the very first sentence of the book. So the name of Genesis is Bereshit, which literally means how would you translate that, Rick? At the start of, or at the head of?
At the start of, yeah. And there are those who see the awkwardness of that as indicative of, the fact that there wasn't some 0 to 1 moment, but when this started to become, which is terrible English, but that's what what I've heard. The article from who is it? Judith Anderson in the New Interpreter's Bible about the history of the Old Testament text is really helpful. It gives you a sense of how the formation of these texts, and how particularly the Septuagint. It's a good deep dive in that if folks are more interested.
Right, and the Exodus is, of course, the second book. Exodus is a good title because it does hint of the Great Departure, which is kind of the main subject of the story. But the Hebrew name is Shemot, which literally means names, which is how the very first verse starts in the story. If you read it, Leviticus is interesting. It's literally Vayikra, which means and he proclaimed, or he preached. And so this is all set up to be the preaching of Moses, and appropriately Numbers probably has a better name in Hebrew. I don't know if you agree with me, Rick, but Numbers is sort of an odd name, arithmoi, the Greek name.
Yeah.
But in the Hebrew version probably makes a little bit more sense. It's Bamidbar, which literally means in the wilderness, which is of course what the story is really about.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy, I could kind of go either way. I think the Greek name is probably a little bit more telling in that one, which literally means the second law, or it could be understood maybe as the different versions of law, copy maybe.
Yeah.
But the Hebrew for Deuteronomy is literally Devarim, which just means words. So the books all have different titles, and sometimes you'll see little interesting rubs when you look really, really closely at the text, and you can see, so I wonder what happened there. So for instance, anybody who's read a lot of Bergsma or Hahn or any of those guys will all just know that Noah's name means rest, right? Noah means rest. But the problem with this is that I'm not surprised, I guess, that apparently no one's ever read the Bible that closely, or their English translation that closely, because as they notice in Genesis 5:29, where this is actually mentioned in the text, and I'll just read you my version here. This is verse 5:28. When Lamech lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah, and he said, he will comfort us in painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. So this is a typical naming etiology verse.
Yeah.
So basically it gives you the name and it tells you why the person has the name. Now notice, so where does it tell us that it means rest? The word rest is never mentioned in the verse. Okay. It mentions instead the verse comfort. Now that's interesting. Where do we get rest then? Is Scott Hahn wrong? Is Bergsman? Well, no, they're right, but they're just drawing from a different tradition. The textual tradition in the Greek Old Testament is in 5:29. It says, "He will give us rest from our labor and painful toil of the hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." So there's rest and there's comfort, and almost certainly what had happened is that there's a Hebrew word, nuach, which is the verb to rest, which also sounds a lot like Noah's name. But if you throw a mem on top of that, and it becomes manach, which literally means to comfort.
Right.
Okay, so there's two verbs, to rest and to comfort. The MT uses comfort. The LXX undoubtedly translated katapausis, which is the Greek for rest. So it was translating it when it was nuach. So originally it probably was nuach. How did we get manach then? Why is manach? Well, probably, Rick, and my guess is, I don't know, you maybe have another theory, but the whole theology of rest became really, really important in the late, Second Temple period. In Isaiah 40, chapter 40, verse 1, the beginning of the whole book of consolation.
Comfort my people.
Comfort my people, exactly.
Yeah.
Manachu lo mi. This became enormously important for restoration theology, much, much more than rest theology had been. And so it may have occurred to them saying, well, the rest of this doesn't quite fit in as much for what this name is, that the real toil relief that we need is this sort of Isaianic rest, the Isaiah 40 verse 1 rest of God promising to bringing about this restoration of
your long service is atoned for. Yeah,
exactly. So both of them are very theologically rich, comfort as well as rest. It's just that rest happens to be the one that most Catholics know about because we've got Scott Hahn to talk about rest, Noah being rest, and it's So it's a very, very interesting example of where a difference can come about simply by a different textual tradition that you're translating from. And of course, there are a couple of other little examples of that too. In the story,
a good hermeneutic is the one that is going to be expansive of possibilities of meaning and not say it has to be this because this fits with, you know, something I'm selling or I'm producing or I'm trying to structure an argument rather than what's called eisegesis rather than exegesis, where you're really taking it from all the variants.
Right. Yeah. So I think we can kind of take it either way. And so what should it be? And I think if you were doing a study on this verse, you would probably have to wrestle with this question and decide what method you're using. Are we dealing with the Hebrew as sort of our source text, the one we have, or are we dealing with the Greek? And to some extent, there's not really necessarily a right answer to that question.
Yeah. More of a both
Hebrews writer in Hebrews chapter 4, and I'm sure you know this, Rick, that when he cites the Noah story, he might actually be referring to rest here. He might actually be thinking of this in the background when he's discussing Sabbath rest. It's possible,
I mean that pops up in a couple places.
Exactly. So and there's little interesting little rubs like that. So for instance, you remember the story, which we're going to see later when we get into it, of a Joseph receiving from his father a coat, right? And
Ketonet pasim, right?
Yes, exactly. There's two versions of what kind of coat he received. In the Hebrew, he received a long sleeve coat. In other words, went down to his wrists and went down to his ankles. But everybody likes the Greek one better because in the Greek one, he gets a multicolored coat. Okay, and so there's just two slightly different versions of the story there. One's a Hebrew, one's a Greek. I'm not sure which one's the older one there. I don't know if you have an idea.
Well, I prefer the Colorado version, where out in the Old West we always had dusters, you know.
That's exactly.
It's cultural.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Dr. Pete, thank you for your time, and we'll talk some more.
Okay, very good.